Welcome back to my channel. I'm Dr. Kate Boyd. I'm so glad to be back here in my house. We had to move out for 4 months and live in Airbnbs, multiple Airbnbs, because of a significant renovation that was taking place at our house. And this is the first video I'm making now that we're back in the house, and it's so good to be back. Today I'm going to talk about how to learn a brand new piece of the piano. This is something that I work on quite a lot with my collegiate and graduate level students. You would think that by the time somebody gets so advanced that they study piano at the collegiate level, that they are already very, very efficient at learning new music. But while this is sometimes true, I have found that this is often not the case. Pretty often, I come across very advanced players who do not have a very organized approach to learning new music. And so what happens is that they spend a lot more time learning the notes of a piece than they really need to, which ends up taking them much, much longer than it really should. And as a result, it can be discouraging and it can even be demoralizing because they feel like they're practicing all the time, but not really making meaningful progress. And this is something that I think many, many pianists can relate to, even if you aren't studying piano at the collegiate or graduate level. If you're a high school student, if you're an adult amateur, if you're playing recreationally, this information can really help you learn music quicker so that you can get to the point where you are being expressive and free and having fun with your playing at the piano. The first thing you need to understand when you're learning a new piece is how the brain processes the new information that you're learning. When you learn a new piece at the piano, the brain is using sensory memory to recall the information. Sensory memory involves your brain remembering how it feels to touch the piano and also how the music sounds as you play it. When we play the piano, we're using a specific sequence of motions to create the sounds that come out of the piano. Sensory information, as the brain processes it, is only held onto the brain for a very short period of time. I mean seconds. When you repeat the same sensory experience several times in a row, the brain will start to move that into the short-term memory, and then eventually, if you repeat it enough times, it'll encode it into the long-term memory, which is where we want it to eventually reside. Now, the quality of the repetitions is what's key here. When you first learn a piece, and especially given the fleeting nature of sensory memory, the brain can only handle a little tiny bit of information at a time. There's a finite amount of new information that the brain can handle and process at any given moment, and this is why the most efficient way to learn a new piece at the piano is to break it down into little, teeny tiny segments and learn them over time. You will start to combine those small segments into larger and larger segments until the whole piece is learned. The idea of learning a piece of music in very, very, very small fragments can seem extremely counterintuitive to us until we compare it to other types of learning. For example, if you're learning a new unit in biology class, it would not be an ideal study method to take an entire chapter of a complex information-packed textbook, read it the whole way through one time, and then when you get to the end of it say, I think I'll go back and I'll read it again and see what I still remember. No, it's pretty clear that that's not going to be a very effective way to learn the material. Instead, what you'd need to do is break it down into pieces and units within the chapter so that you can memorize each piece of the information. To study effectively, you would need to find ways to retain that information, and that would involve a lot of repetition, a lot of drilling, and breaking it down into little pieces. Maybe you'd make flashcards or practice writing out a complex process in order to remember all the parts. I actually have a very vivid memory from high school biology of writing out the process of photosynthesis over and over and over on a little chalkboard that we had in the playroom in the basement of our house in order to retain all of the steps of the process in order. Another example of learning that relates to music study is language study. If you're preparing for a vocabulary test in German class, for example, you're not going to just take a list of 50 words and read them in order, over and over and over, hoping to retain them. No, that's not going to be very effective at all. Instead, in order to learn 50 vocabulary words efficiently and increase your ability to retain them, you're going to need to divide them into groups. You're going to probably figure out what words go together, and you're going to memorize the words for tea and cup and spoon and fork all as one group, and then probably you would memorize the words for ball and sport and net and sneakers in a different group. You wouldn't just randomly try to memorize all the words in any given jumbled up order. This is because the brain is a pattern-seeking instrument. Once you master the small groupings of words, then you would expand it and combine them to make larger and larger groups of words until you've learned all 50 words. This process is called chunking. The APA Dictionary of Psychology defines chunking the following way. Chunking is the process by which the mind divides large pieces of information into smaller units called chunks. That makes them easier to retain in short-term memory. The units themselves can range from simple chunks, for example, individual letters or numbers, to complex chunks, for example, words or phrases. The exact number of chunks remembered depends on the size of each chunk. And so, this is why when you learn a new piece, it's most effective to not try to tackle the whole entire piece as one large undifferentiated piece, but instead divide it into smaller little pieces to learn. And then, as you do multiple repetitions of them, you can string these pieces together to create larger and larger sections. That is chunking. The reason it's important to do repetitions is because the short-term memory can only hold onto something for 10 to 30 seconds. And it's extremely limited in terms of the number of items it can hold at once. There's a lot of continuing research on this, but it seems that the short-term memory has the capacity to hold around 7 items, give or take a couple. And so if we're trying to remember 7 unrelated items, that will max out our short-term memory. But if we can chunk things together and repeat them so that the brain recognizes them as each one being a discrete musical idea or unit, then there starts to be more space in the short-term memory and the brain for more material. Now, the 2 examples I gave were mental skills. I talked about remembering a biology text, and I also talked about remembering a series of words in a foreign language. But playing the piano is not only a mental skill, it's also very much a physical skill. What you're doing when you learn a new piece is you're teaching your fingers and hands new motor skills and new combinations of movements. So there's overlap between learning a new piece at the piano and learning a new golf swing, or learning how to pitch, or learning how to play basketball. But we don't intuitively think of it that way because we focus so much on the product of music. We focus so much on the actual sounds and the artistic line that we're creating that it's easy to sometimes forget that the initial stage of learning the piece involves remembering and retaining physical motions in certain combinations and in a certain order. The physical motions that we make at the piano are what create the sound in the first place. So this is why at the end of the day you want to break your physical motions down into very, very small units in order to learn a new piece. Now the length of the unit you'll practice depends on the difficulty of the material. If it's very, very difficult, you're going to want to have a very small snippet so that your brain and your sensory memory can process it and encode it into the short-term memory so that then with repetitions it can be retained and encoded into the long-term memory over time. If the piece, the section, or the phrase is not that challenging, you don't need to break it into teeny tiny little units. It really depends on how easy it feels to you the first time you play it. The idea is that you break down your music into the smallest units that make sense to you to practice, and you drill those, and then over time you chunk them together to create longer and longer phrases and longer musical ideas, all the way until you have the piece completely learned. So here's the thing. It's intuitive to break down a biology text in the way that I described, and it's also somewhat intuitive to break down a group of vocabulary words into smaller groups and then memorize those and then recombine them. However, with music, we tend to think of that as a long, continuous line. We don't tend to sing half of a phrase and then stop. We don't go, happy birthday, and then go, day to you. We go, happy birthday to you. It would be very unintuitive to only sing a fragment of it, and it feels jarring if you try. It's most natural to our understanding of music to do a whole musical phrase or a whole musical line all at once. Therefore, when you're practicing, you're going to want to do 2 things. Practice in musical gestures and cultivate the discipline to stop yourself and go back and repeat the musical gesture you're working on. What I mean by practicing musical gestures is to listen to what notes naturally go together and practice them as a group. The analogy I always use to illustrate that is to point out that you would never memorize a vocabulary list 1 syllable at a time, because taken individually, each syllable has no meaning. and you'd be making the task of memorizing your 50-word list orders of magnitude more difficult if you try to do that. Also, as I just mentioned, when you're practicing, it's really important to discipline yourself to stop and then go back and repeat a little teeny tiny musical gesture, as opposed to just keep on going and reading a whole giant section that is a little bit too long for your brain to really process and retain. Developing this skill is key to effectively learning a new piece. Try not to get too absorbed in the physical aspect of learning your new piece, and instead work on having enough self-awareness to know exactly which musical gesture you're working on, where the segment starts and stops, and when you're going to stop and go back, and how many repetitions you're going to do. So today I've talked about your sensory memory, how to encode it into the short-term and eventually the long-term memory. I've talked about the idea of chunking and why that's the most efficient way to approach a piece that's brand new. And I've also talked about how what we do at the piano is a physical combination of motions that need to be repeated sufficiently in order for our short-term memory to hang on to them and to eventually encode them into our longer-term memory. In my next video, I'm going to take you through my 6-point system for learning a new piece, and I'm going to show you exactly how I apply it to a brand new piece. While you're waiting for that video, you can click on this video I made about what to do before you even start a new piece. So go ahead and click on that video to continue. I'll see you there, and happy practicing.